I got back about a week ago from Panama City Beach. Every 2 years, my extended family gathers at that beach for that week between Christmas Day and New Year's Day. There are 3 clergy people in my family, so we all come exhausted after the Christmas Day services, and we gather at the beach. And 2 years ago, when we arrived at the house that my dad had rented, I was shocked because it was directly across the street from a Christian retreat center that my best friends and I stayed during summers when we were 18 or 19 years old. And I hadn't revisited it since then. My family stayed in that same house again this year, and it started to feel kind of eerie to me that of all the beach houses in all of Florida, we have somehow adopted this one that is directly across the street from this Christian retreat center. The exact spot I can now say I've been coming for nearly 25 years. I went swimming one day. It was 50 degrees outside, but I could not resist. And as I was in the water with my daughter and my sister-in-law, words came back to my mind from a poem that I had written when I was 18 and at this beach. I will not quote the lines of that poem to you now. Most of the poems that we write at 18 should never be heard or read by anyone. But it struck me that there in that same place, the words came back to me almost like they were echoing in those waves. Another day while we were there, my dad started talking about the first time he came to Panama City Beach. And I didn't know this, but he first came to Panama City Beach in 1968. He was on a spring break family vacation from St. Louis to Panama City, the weekend that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. It was interesting hearing him talk about this memory. He said it was years before he recognized the racism embedded in the way his parents talked about the event. They said, well, maybe it was for the best. King was such a rabble-rouser. Dad said it was in part returning to that same place by those same waters that he found himself thinking about that, and that things began to become clearer to him. On that same 1968 trip, my dad, who was 12 at the time, was on the radio for the first time in his life. It happened by chance. He read an ad for the hotel they were staying at on the local radio station. 10 years after that, my dad began his lifelong career, in radio. So Panama City Beach, it's a weird place. And this sermon isn't about my slight family connection to Panama City Beach, and that's not a sentence I ever thought I would find myself saying, my family connection to Panama City Beach of all places. But I couldn't help but think over the last couple of weeks about what it does to us to be near water like that. And maybe about the ways that water compels us to speak, to write poetry, to sing songs, to grab a microphone. About that way that it's almost cliched, right? Being at the edge of the ocean feels revelatory. It shows us something true about who we are and what we're here for. If there is something about the water that moves us in unique ways to speak, perhaps that's part of what it means for us to be made in the image of God. Because in all 3 texts that we read this morning, what we see is a God who is moved to speak over the waters. In the beginning, when all that was formless and void, welter and waste, the Spirit of God hovered over the surface of the waters. That's where God was hanging out. And there, over the surface of the waters, God was moved to speak. Let there be light. And when the psalmist describes the glory and the strength of God, the psalmist begins by saying, "The voice of the Lord is upon the waters." The waters in Hebrew scriptures, often a symbol of chaos, the unknown, what is powerful and uncontrollable. The psalmist says God is above the waters. God's voice is louder even than those thundering waves. The psalm continues with these images of what God's voice does. And while in Genesis chapter 1, God's voice created, here God's voice seems to destroy. It breaks the cedar trees. It shakes the wilderness. It strips the forest bare from the cedars of Lebanon to the wilderness of Kadesh. God's voice echoes over all of Israel's geography and beyond. These images of destruction can be troubling, but a little context helps to know, for instance, that throughout the whole of biblical poetry, the cedars of Lebanon are a symbol of proud loftiness, of arrogance, setting oneself up as independent of God. So what the psalmist is saying is not that God is willfully destroying God's creation, but that God's voice strikes down the arrogant. That God's voice echoes farther than we can travel, past Lebanon and past Kadesh, beyond the edges of our known geography. That God's voice is stronger than the deepest and most mysterious and powerful ocean. God's voice above the waters is both a comfort and a warning for us. I wonder, as the Spirit of God hovers over the waters now and sees the decreation we participate in, sees ice caps melt, floods increase, droughts increase, microplastics showing up in every body of water, and governments around the world using water and controlling the accessibility of water as a way to engage in warfare or to control their people. Surely God sees some arrogance and some willful blindness in us to all this destruction that we're complicit in. And surely the voice of God is thundering over the waters even now with warnings to us about the places we love, the places God loves. So we see in Genesis God's voice creating, and we see in the psalm God's voice striking down the arrogant, God's voice as strong and addressing injustice. And then in our gospel reading, God's voice speaks over the waters yet again. And this time, God's not creating and God's not destroying. God is naming. Jesus has come to his cousin John to be baptized. And as Jesus rises out of the water, the heavens open, and the voice of God comes down saying, "You are my beloved Son. In you I have taken delight." The writer of Mark's gospel wants us to think of Genesis 1 here, of how God hovered over the surface of the waters and then took delight in the creation that God called good. We have, between that moment in Genesis of creation and this moment in Mark's gospel, we have seen the good creation damaged by sin and arrogance and greed. We have seen our need for a rescuer, our inability to save ourselves. And now in these baptismal waters, we see our salvation. All of God's good, damaged creation is taken up into the body of Jesus, in whom all things were created, in whom all things hold together, in whom all things are being reconciled to God. And in these baptismal waters, with God's blessing, all is being restored, reborn. And we all rise from these baptismal waters with Jesus. And we rise to, as my friend Joel Marcus says, we rise to do battle against the forces of negation that crush the hopes of humanity. To do battle against the forces of negation that crush the hopes of humanity and all creation. That's part of what we'll proclaim in just a minute as we speak again the words of our baptismal covenant. When we promise to persevere in resisting evil and to strive for justice and peace. Over these waters, once again, God is compelled to speak. And God says to Jesus, "You are my beloved Son." And God says to us, because of and through Jesus, "You are my beloved children." These are words that show us something true about who we are and why we're here. Words that invite us to come to the edge of the water and to join together with all those creatures the psalmist tells us are in the temple of the Lord even now, proclaiming glory.